Hello again. I'd like to bring you all to order because the magic moment has arrived. I could tell you a lot about Mimi Sheraton, but all of you in the room know a lot about her. And what an eminent, fabulous, entertaining, wonderful writer she is about food and other subjects. I'm going to read only one line from her fabulous book, which we've sold out of, so now you have to buy it online at Amazon or someplace to drive up her book sales ratings. But this is like the line from Mimi Sheraton that I will quote to journalism classes if I ever lecture one again. Indeed, a savvy editor I worked for once accused me of being a person who appears to be doing one thing, but who is really doing something else. He sure had my number, as the food articles I proposed were invariably inspired by the places I wanted to see. Parentheses, want to visit southern Spain, question mark? Why not suggest an article on the growing, harvesting, and curing of capers, question mark? It worked for me, and it might work for you. Now, I have never read a better definition of a journalist's boondoggle than that. I mean, if there was, that is up there with like how to fill out your expense account in terms of professional expertise. So on that note, I welcome Mimi to the podium. Our fellow Silurian, I might add.
I really have to thank you all for being here. It's not only wonderful to see a room full of people who have come to hear me talk about this, but so many old friendly faces, so many steps in my career. Obviously, many friends from the New York Times, but I have to especially say it was almost a shock to see Ed Fancher, the publisher of the original Village Voice, which I worked for when Dan Wolfe was there and Dave Margulies and Norman Mailer, and that was sort of an introduction to how you can say what you really want to say. And I think that that plus New York Magazine after it, and Jane Maxwell, who was Clay's first most important assistant, is here. And when you work for places like that, you know you can take really big chances and say what you want, and then you make a name, and then when you have the name, the New York Times calls you. So those were the steps. I have said in the introduction to 1,000 Foods that it is in many ways an autobiography. And what Alan pointed out has always been true. I was very influenced as a child by a poem in Robert Louis Stevenson's Child Garden of Verses. It was called Travel, and it begins, I would like to rise and go where the golden apples grow. And that lodged in my mind, and I have had one long boondoggle, he's right about that, rising and going in search of golden apples. When you do research on food and are fortunate enough to travel all over the world, it begins to define your life, which is what makes it partially the framework of an autobiography. The friends I've made all over, the peculiar not only countries, but corners of countries and streets I would never have wandered into if I weren't looking for a particular ingredient or a restaurant or a dish or someone to interview. Some of the best restaurants that I've found have been in streets lined with auto body shops, which I would certainly not have gotten to if it hadn't been a particular seafood restaurant in Israel, for example, or a meat steak restaurant in Rome, all where there were auto body shops. Food, of course, which I've been writing about for 60 plus years, the first place I wrote about it was Q Magazine, where I reviewed restaurants, and they thought Mimi Sheraton was a very improbable name, and would I please write as Martha Martin. So for 3 years, I was Martha Martin. and finally came out at the Village Voice as Mimi Sheraton. Food is a wonderful handle with which to pick up cultures. It's religion, it's superstition, it's lore, it's economy, it's craft, it's art. And I think when you meet strangers who are in your realm of interest, you meet on a common ground, which makes it much, much easier to establish a friendship. When people ask, why did you write the book? And frankly, the answer was money. And the hope that it would do as well as its predecessor, which inspired me, by Workman, the same publisher, 1,000 Places to See Before You Die. I had dinner with the author of that, and I thought, why not 1,000 foods? So I went home and said to my dear husband, Richard Falcone, who I lost 1.5 years ago and never saw the book come to fruition, I thought about doing this, and he said, you're out of your mind. And he was right, because the contract called for delivery in 2 years, and it took 10. Not every day for 10 years, but a 10-year obligation. Through it all, Peter Workman, who created that great publishing company and who left a legacy of similar behavior and ethics, they never once threatened to pull the plug, nor handed me the author's nightmare, return the advance. That never happened. It took 10 years. When I was first decided I was going to do it, I sat down and wrote a list of what I thought should be in it, just off the top of my head, and I had close to 1,800 items. I obviously had to hone that. New things presented themselves, and I was trying very much for a global spread, because I think people who can consider something they consider horrible to eat as much loved in another country, maybe there's the possibility of understanding, though I would not say that's true of Vegemite. If anybody has ever had Vegemite, it's the Australian version of Marmite. And I went to the Vegemite factory in Melbourne, Australia, and when someone from the factory met me at the airport, as we began to approach in the car, I smelled something funny. And he said, that means we're 5 miles from the plant. And yet, Australian and New Zealand children eat it the way our kids eat peanut butter. So I kept trying it to see what the appeal was. And it must have just been habit for something very salty, very yeasty, very fetid, and I think very good for you. I drew inspiration for meals not only from ingredients and whole meals and dishes, but from sources like literature and film and art. Roman fruits, for example, in summer, where I was inspired to consider those after a painting by Caravaggio called A Basket of Summer Fruit. And so it explains the fruits in the painting. Mozzarella and carrozza, the marvelous French fried cheese sandwich that Italian mothers give their children when there's nothing else around to make. I don't know how many of you remember the film The Bicycle Thief. And there was a wonderful scene in which this little boy just in raptures eats mozzarella and carrozza in a restaurant, while the anguish on his father's face tells you he has no money to pay for that, and the moment will come when he has to announce that. There was also a marvelous book written by Jorge Amado called Gabriella, Clove and Cinnamon, about a wonderful barmaid, cook, dancer in a bar, and it recounts her visits to the local food markets in Bahia, where she picks out all of the typical foods of Brazil and then the dishes that she prepares from them. So those were some of the things that inspired me very much. One of the things that took a very long time was sourcing everything. Everything had to be available. If I had known this in the beginning, I would never have agreed to do the book. everything had to be available in one form or another. Either if it was, you could have it in a restaurant somewhere in the world, but hopefully also somewhere in the United States. If it was an ingredient, where you could buy it, whether it was in a store or online. And you would be surprised at what Amazon sells online in the way of food. I had sour morella cherry jam from Moldova, which I got on Amazon. So that was only the beginning of, as much as I hated to do anything for Amazon, considering what they're doing for authors. Nevertheless, in the end, everything is sourced with a recipe from a book and also online. And I had researchers gathering those, and then I looked at them all and selected the one I thought was most what I had in mind. Obviously, what led up to all of this and gave me the experience was traveling around the world and reviewing restaurants, often with very funny happenings and occurrences. I remember once a restaurant still there called Omen in Soho, which was a Japanese sort of a version of a noodle soup restaurant. And my husband and I were there with our teenage son, with friends who had a teenage daughter with us, and the kids were really hungry. And you know, the Japanese portions are very small, and the kids swooped down and ate everything as soon as it got to the table. And I spied a morsel on the other side of the table that looked like daikon radish soaked in soy sauce. And I reached over with chopsticks and got it, and I said, "This tastes like paper soaked in soy sauce," at which point my husband said, "You're eating my napkin." And rather than be embarrassed, I was so proud of having identified it correctly, because that's the role of a food critic. I know paper soaked in soy sauce when I taste it. So, and there were other marvelous things when being recognized in a Chinese restaurant and having one of the employees call another nearby Chinese restaurant where a relative was working to come and see the golden mouth, which is what the Chinese restaurants identified me as. Or have a restaurant bring in a chef from another nearby restaurant of the same owner but a better chef. That happened in an Italian restaurant on 59th Street. He came in carrying the tortellini that I had ordered in the one I was in. I would not like to be doing it now. I have to say, from a critical standpoint, from a journalistic standpoint, it's very unpleasant now. There's a fever about being first with reviews. There's a terrible amount of new restaurants opening at a crazy pace, and there's the digital factor, which is very competitive. It's very, very hard to overcome some of those reviews. It's also very difficult to remain anonymous. I think with Instagram and sending pictures all over, many critics now have even given up the pretense of being anonymous. And I think that's too bad, because it's never the same place when they know you. No matter what, critics will say, what can they do when I arrive and they didn't expect me? I once wrote an article for Vanity Fair on all of the things a restaurant can do when a critic appears, although unexpectedly. And I had a call from a man named Adi Giovanetti, who used to have a restaurant called Il Nido, very good Italian restaurant. And he called me and said, "Signora, you don't know the half of it. We can do much more than that. If you order an appetizer, we have plenty of time to fix up the main course." And then he said, "We can even quiet a noisy group sitting around you." But I didn't want to ask how. I thought. But it is true that it is a different experience. The other competition now, of course, which is pointless and yet powerful, consumer-rated reviews, consumer response like Yahoo and Urban Spoon, and for my money, even Zagat, because nobody knows if those respondents have even gone to the places that they are voting on. Another factor, to get back for the book for a minute, I had to trim entries from some countries to make room for others. I very much wanted to have West Africa in, because having been to a number of those restaurants in Harlem, and there are some very good ones now, I had a feeling it was going to become one of the big fusion influences, and I think in the next 2 or 3 years it will be. So although I could have had 1,000 from Italy, 1,000 from France, China, the United States, those are the largest categories, I think. I trimmed to get Senegal and Nigeria, Ethiopia, which is not West Africa, but an influential cuisine. And that's it, and the book came out, and at least 5 restaurants that were in it were already closed. So for the second printing, I had to find substitutes with the same number of letters, because we didn't have to want to reset the page. You can all sympathize with that. So I think it's an ongoing life's work, and for me, it's just a memoir of wonderful people and places and experiences I've had, because I gave up writing about home furnishings to write about food, and it was a smart move. And I wonder if anybody has questions. I would love to answer them.